The combative strength of an army is largely determined by the loyalty of its soldiers. If the soldiers who make up the army are not loyal to the army faces major threats during the war. Loyalty to the army is to not surrender and fight no matter the circumstances. Since the war between Ukraine and Russia began, we have witnessed many incidents involving Russian soldiers. But one of the most important of these was the disloyalty of the Russian soldiers. In recent days, interesting allegations have emerged about the disloyalty of the Russian soldiers to the Russian army. As you know, the offensive operations of the Ukrainian Armed Forces are continuing quite violently. Therefore, the pressure on Russian soldiers is quite great. Russian soldiers who cannot stand this pressure, on the other hand, fail the loyalty test. Russian troops who recently failed the loyalty test have surrendered. So, what is the details on this incident? Let's take a look together. As you know, the war has spread to the northern front in recent days. On this front, Russian troops wanted to turn the weak Ukrainian fortifications to advantage, because the significant part of the Ukrainian Armed Forces wanted to capture Russian positions with operations on the southern front line. The operation of Russian troops on the northern front, on the other hand, did not produce the expected results. Despite the weak fortification of the Ukrainian troops on the northern front, the Russian troops did not manage to overcome these fortifications. Especially due to the furious responses of the Ukrainian artillery to the Russian attacks, the Russian troops ended each attack by withdrawing. The Kremlin region was one of these points. Russian troops in the region were carrying out offensive operations at this point, but the Ukrainian defense forces were even stronger than the Russian soldiers expected. Moreover, the Russian commanders comforted the Russian soldiers they directed to this region by stating that the Ukrainian fortifications were weak. But Russian soldiers faced a bitter truth on the front line. Because although the fortifications of the Ukrainian armed forces in the region were weak, the Ukrainian soldiers were committed to the fight with great loyalty. Therefore, they were one step ahead of the Russian troops. Recently, according to reports of local sources, Russian troops launched a new offensive in the region. The aim of the Russian troops was to break through the Ukrainian defense in the region. In this way, it was expected that the Russian troops would quickly take over the dominance on the northern front. However, the Ukrainian defense forces were prepared in the face of this attack by Russian troops. Responding to these attacks by Russian troops with artillery fire, the Ukrainian defense forces managed to repel the Russian troops. Moreover, the Ukrainian infantry began to follow the retreating Russian soldiers and managed to corner the groups of several Russian soldiers. Now the Russian soldiers who had left their units were all alone in front of the Ukrainian troops. The Russian commanders have a definite order to their soldiers. Any soldier surrendering or fleeing to the enemy for any reason during the war is punished with a great penalty. Therefore, Russian soldiers are ordered to stay at the front regardless of conditions. But these soldiers, pursued and cornered by Ukrainian infantry, did not listen to the orders of the Russian commanders. A group of Russian soldiers surrendered to Ukrainian troops without firing a single bullet. According to the allegations, the Russian soldiers who surrendered are made up of young and inexperienced soldiers. Many experts say that it is quite usual for these young and inexperienced Russian soldiers to surrender, because these young Russian soldiers do not have combat experience. The obligations imposed by the heavy frontline conditions and the difficulties experienced in the frontline conditions are quite wearing out these Russian soldiers. According to many experts, it is quite usual for a soldier who cannot accept being forced to fight during the most productive and fun periods of his life to surrender. Images of Russian soldiers surrendering were posted on social media. These images, which have been viewed by millions of users, have caused a great shock to the Russian public. Russian public opinion is divided about the surrendered Russian soldiers. One of these two groups interprets the surrender of Russian soldiers as treason. According to the allegations, the people who made this comment are Russian citizens who propagandized Russian Federation President Vladimir Putin in exchange for money. The other group welcomes the surrender of Russian soldiers as quite usual. According to this group, all Russian soldiers must somehow find a way to leave the Ukrainian field. Usually, this group includes the families of Russian soldiers forcibly sent to the front line and opponents of Putin. According to many experts, if the Ukrainian counteroffensive continues with this violence, it is possible that we will hear more news about the surrender of more Russian soldiers to the Ukrainian armed forces. Of course, this situation retains the quality of being an allegation. We can say that we can see the truth of this claim in coming days. There is no good news from the Russian Federation on the front line. However, the Russian government is not only agitated by what is happening on the front line, because the unusual events taking place within the borders of Russia greatly frightened the Russian administration. As you may remember recently, many places in Russia, including Moscow, the capital of the Russian Federation, were shaken by explosions. The drone attacks on the Russian capital caused a great panic in the city and found a very wide place on the world agenda. Unusual events continued to take place in Moscow. An oxygen battery tank was located in the village of Aksakovo in the Russian capital Moscow. This warehouse was blown up with a big explosion recently. Oxygen batteries reacting with explosive materials further increased the severity of the explosion. After the explosion, a large fire occurred in the warehouse. The events that took place caused a great panic in the village of Achkasovo. Russian sources did not provide any explanation about the latest developments in the region. However, local sources make many claims. The most important of these claims is the possibility that Russian separatist groups may have been mobilized again. As you know, Russian separatist groups are made of people who have come together in opposition to Russian President Vladimir Putin. These groups do not recognize both the occupation of Ukraine and the legitimacy of the Russian leader Putin. It is claimed by local sources that Russian separatist groups, which have carried out many operations to end the Russian army's occupation of Ukraine since the war began, targeted the oxygen battery depot with explosive. It is estimated that the events have taken place within Russia's borders in recent days have encouraged Russian separatist groups. We will continue to transmit information about the explosions in the region for you. And what do you think? Do you think we will see more Russian soldiers surrendering to the Ukrainian Armed Forces? How much does the Ukrainian army's counterattack have an impact on the surrender of Russian soldiers? Who do you think is responsible for the explosions in Russia? Who is causing explosions at important targets in Russia? And why are they doing this? We care about your opinions. Please share them with us.